great professional development opportunity when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and just realized that it really deserved a topic, conversation all of its own. So really excited that she's sharing today on some information shared previously, but in more depth, and some training that she does. So we're going to talk about building an LGBTQ inclusive mentoring. So I'm going to turn it over to Annie, and thank you so much for sharing today, and thanks everybody for being here. And I know she'll have time for questions at the end, and if you want to put anything in chat as a placeholder, don't anything. This is your time to have a discussion and have questions answered. So Annie, thanks so much. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Mary. So yeah, building LGBTQ plus inclusive mentoring, kind of just thinking about, especially it's very prevalent now. Well, there's been a lot more representation and a lot more media presentation of the LGBTQ community and what does that mean for mentoring. So I got to figure out how best to do this with two things open at the same time. So yeah, just a few things to kind of we'll look at for today. Terms and history. A lot of people can be confused a little bit about some of the terms or what they mean and might interrelate them to think that they're the same thing, even though they're not. So that's a very important part. So look at some program adaptations. Some of these are ones that we have been working with, as well as ones that we come from the elements of effective practices, LGBTQ plus youth added part of the EEP. So that part, and then the Q&A at the end, just kind of if you have questions that you're always afraid to ask, that you get the chance to. It's a nice opportunity that way. So looking at terms and history, a little bit of this is kind of what we went over at the last presentation in March. But yes, just kind of getting to, oh cool, it gives me the notes. I didn't know Teams did that, so looking at some of the definitions. Of course, with all of this, labels are descriptive. That's always the most important part, that labels are not prescriptive. So people choose labels that help them define themselves, not necessarily they want to hold to a label and they have to be very strict about following exactly that which the label defines, which can be very hard, and that labels change quite often. They can change quite a bit. So first off, you have sex that's assigned at birth, which can be typically is male or female. There is also intersex, which is more prevalent, which is kind of a combination of the two, or it could be genetic variations, different XY chromosomes or chromosomal mix, 3 chromosomes that define sex, 1 differences of whether or not a person can produce androgen or not. Lots of interesting ways that goes about. But when it comes down to it, there really is no, for sure, scientifically 100% accurate way of proving that this person is this. When I talk about sex assigned at birth, I always joke that it's kind of the doctor is getting all the information that they have from the child in the one day that they see them as soon as they're born and making a best guess. You don't take a chromosome test at birth. For the most part, they are just looking at genitals and determining based off of what they appear to look like. And even then, there are certain surgical procedures that are done to alter the genitals so that they fit either the male or female box better, especially with intersex children. So that's that aspect. Sexual orientation. This is the ones that have to do with who you love. Who one loves, who one wants to be with, physical attraction as part of that as well, of who one is physically attracted to, what gender they are, as far as, and also romantic attraction, which is very important for asexual identifying people, because they are very strong about, yes, they identify as asexual, but they might have preferences romantically of who they're emotionally attracted to. So the orange and the red on the gender unicorn there. And a lot of these prefixes for sexual orientation come from Greek and Latin. So hetero means more than, or it means opposite. Homo, same, bi, more than one. Pan, all. A is a negation of something, so asexual, or demi, which means partially. And in this case, demisexual would be those that are attracted to somebody, but they have to have that emotional bond as well, and it's part of the asexual spectrum. Then we go down and we have gender identity, which this is not the same as sexual orientation. So this is the most common faux pas, is like, if you're transgender, then you're gay. And it's like, those are two different things. So gender identity is how one identifies themselves. So how they see themselves and how they wish to be perceived by those around them. Not perfectly understood where it comes from, but it has been noted that children as early as 2 years old, whether they are cisgender, they identify the same as what they're assigned at birth, or transgender, which they identify as something different than what they're assigned at birth. At 2 years old, they have a sense of their own gender identity, that they have a sense that, that they want to be playing with the other girls or with the other boys, how they see themselves that way. Common terms here go with is AMAB, so assigned male at birth, and AFAB, assigned female at birth. Again, a lot of that has to do with just kind of categorizing in a certain sense, based off of what information was given from the doctor, which can be important for when you're talking about hormonal treatments and things like that. Some older terms as well are MTF, so male to female, transgender women, and female to male, so FTM as well. But then also non-binary are people that identify outside of the gender binary. They could be both, they could be neither, they could be all genders. There are multiple different ways that people identify. And some people can switch multiple times throughout their life as well. And then lastly is gender expression. So that's all about how one presents themselves. So it's all about how you dress, mannerisms, things like that, can be identified as more female, feminine, masculine, androgynous, or other. And it's all about what the cultural norm of those things are. So when you think of things like drag, that is a gender expression sort of event. That is an art form that uses gender expression to usually take it to kind of absurd ends, in order to, either accentuate or as a performance art of characterizing those caricaturizing, those gender expressions and the stereotypical gender norm, which is a lot of words. So if you ask us about the pride flags, there are a lot of them, and so many different identities. The major ones, the LGBTQ and I and A, are the most important ones. We're not going to go over every flag because there are a lot of them. But really what it comes down to, those are all variations of either sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. And that goes through all of these individual sort of presentations. The L, the G, the B, the T, the Q, I, and A. L is for lesbian or sapphic women, who basically are homosexual females, either cis or trans. And the more common term nowadays is WLW, or women loving women. Similarly for G, for gay and homosexual males, cis and trans. The new kind of the more up-to-date term is MLM, men loving men, not multi-level marketing, because we don't want pyramid schemes, but men loving men. Bisexual, the B, attracted to more than one gender. There's also pansexual, omnisexual, and other variations. And a lot of those, there's nuance within a lot of those, a lot of the labels there. And the nuance is something that that person usually, they identify more with one than others. So that's the one they prefer to use. Transgender is basically just a person whose gender identity is different than the sex they were assigned at birth. That is it. So it can be male, female, non-binary, gender fluid, all the other forms can fall under that as well. Queer questioning is Q. Queer is a reclaimed term that we have brought back to the community. It can be used as a slur still against us, so that's a really interesting one as far as usage. That you don't want to, you want to make sure that you're not using it in a way that somebody's going to be offended by, basically. It has been kind of a push more and more to be called the queer community, but that's, again, depends on the person's comfort level. I is for those that are intersex, so they are naturally part of the LGBTQIA+. And then A is for not ally, as oftentimes every Pride Month it comes around, and that's always the case. It's not ally, but for those that are asexual, or experience little to no sexual attraction to others, or aromantic, no romantic attraction to others, or agender, not identifying as any particular gender in that sort of way. And then, of course, the plus is, of course, opening to all the other sort of identities and variations off of those basic ones as well. Yeah. I should open up the chats, but I haven't. Historically, there's kind of been, I mean, everybody's kind of made a big deal about the rise of members of, you know, how I think it's Gen Z is like 6 to 12%, somewhere like that, of the population is LGBTQIA. A lot of that actually mirrors the rise of a different sort of increase that was all of a sudden. Left-handedness. In the early 1900s, left-handedness was less than 4% of the population. By 1940s, it was 12% of the population. And it wasn't so much that more people were born left-handed. It was just that it wasn't so harmful to be out as left-handed. They weren't doing the abusive things of forcing them to write with their right hand, beating them if they did anything left-handed. All those sorts of things kind of went away. And so the stigma and the oppression of it went away. So more people were more visible in coming out. A lot of the things around the LGBTQ community is that same way, is that there's more acceptance currently. So there's a lot more visibility. There's a lot more people that are okay identifying as LGBTQ, so that they're not going to be necessarily discriminated against without some of that fear. Both very natural and historical. There are history going back for many, many years. The ancient Greeks and Romans and many different indigenous civilizations had same-sex attraction, same-sex couples. Actually, it was often that the Greek were supposed to love their fellow soldiers, so that way they would be closer bonded to each other, as ways to help them so that they would stand for their loved ones that are fighting alongside them in war. There's also been remains, like the one article there, of a caveman near Prague, where it is the traditional skeletal structure of a male found in a burial chamber for women only, and buried in a way that is that was for women at that time period. So even transgender people existing over 6,000 years ago. In nature, we see it a lot as well. I think there are, when I looked it up, there are at least 26 noted ones, and there might be more of different animals and different interactions between them. Most notably, especially when it comes to other more intelligent animals, dolphins and monkeys are actually, and socialized, I should say, animals are very prevalent with same-sex attractions or same-sex sexual activities or relationships. as well as kind of redefining gender roles as well. So what do the risks of all of it actually mean for the youth especially? Unfortunately, since it is still not the norm and is often fought against, there are still high risks of bullying and discrimination that are very strong. Being at home, parents can be very not supportive, would be the nice way of putting it, or they would use religion to justify tough love, basically saying that, oh, it's just a phase, or we don't actually accept that from you, or, you know, that's a sinful thing and you shouldn't be doing it. Religion does play a lot into home life. There's a high percentage of youth that are kicked out from their home and become homeless because of the fact that they are coming out and their parents do not accept them. It's not always the case. There are so many other things, but there are also a lot of microaggressions that come out as well from parents that want to have their kids be the way that they remember them. And that's the way that they're supposed to be, right? Which does not necessarily help. So you'll get, it's just one of those where it's very concerning to have to constantly correct and readjust them and redirect them to be like, hey, you know, that's not the identity that I am anymore. That's not how I identify. And if you can't really, it just doesn't show as much respect from them to not take that seriously. Religion-wise, can be kind of up and down. In Christian culture, there is very strong anti-LGBTQ sort of push that comes in most sects of the denominations. There is no text really in the Greek or Hebrew book, in the Greek or Hebrew Bible, that actually condemns homosexual activity. There has been some very bad translations that are intentionally mistranslated that way. And the most common one that is brought up from 1 Corinthians, the context in which it comes from is much more about temple prostitution than anything else. If you want to argue anything about that with me, feel free. I have my degree from Rome in theology, but it's one of those that it's often brought up, but it's often brought up as just like a boom, there's the answer, done. And it's not actually the case that all religions are like that. In Islam, homosexuality is deemed a choice, but transgender individuals are not. Transgender individuals are deemed as born that way and are very much accepted in the community, which is very strange. And the same can be said depending on the orthodoxy of Jewish faith traditions, are much more open to both transgender and same-sex relationships as part of their part of their religion and community as well. Around school, there's a lot of lack of representation in history, social studies, biology, and health classes. It is something that, and this is currently something that's really fought over with people that want to either opt out or basically say that these people cannot exist, or teach that LGBTQ youth, should not exist. As far as they don't exist in history, they don't exist in health class, we don't talk about them, so they just go away, which is very harmful for the youth because then they feel like nobody understands who they are, or that there's something wrong, or they're an outsider. And additionally, kids can be quite cruel and definitely will bully those that are different than them, and are more likely to use harmful slurs oftentimes than adults are. As well as the current legislation going around about banning transgender athletes from competing on the preferred gender teams. It's very interesting that they want trans men to compete with women when they literally take testosterone, steroids, basically, to compete in women's sports. But that's not the one they complain about. The one they complain about is trans women competing in women's sports, which, in my experience, before transition, when I was still in high school, we used to scrimmage, like junior, senior, we'd scrimmage at the girls' basketball team from Cuba City, Wisconsin, and they would whoop us so bad. They were taller, stronger, better athletes. So it's a very interesting take that they put on it. It's just something that they really just want to drive a wedge and make sure that people don't feel safe enough to be fully participating at school and really thriving with those communities like sports and other, other programs that they have. And then society at large, while acceptance is on the rise in America, hate crimes are also on the rise. And yeah, a lot of these laws that are coming out about bathrooms, refusing service, marriage, adoption, housing, all the other things are eerily similar to Jim Crow laws. And then there are a lot of that propaganda that is surrounding them, that we're going to destroy family life as we know it, which is exactly what they said about integrating schools and interracial marriages in the 60s. So yeah, I'd love to make those parallels. Some community figures that have been very vocal about being against the LGBTQ community: J.K. Rowling, Elon Musk, Mike Pence, and many others. Even Caitlyn Jenner came out and said that trans girls should not compete in sports, even though she, as a trans woman, competes in, women's tournaments. Anyways, it's very fine. So yeah, that's become a whole different thing. The Equality Act is something that is before the Senate, but who knows when that'll actually go through. And then yes, lastly, higher suicide and brain health risks if not supported. So while there are, higher rates of depression, higher rates of anxiety, higher rates of attempted suicide, that is part of being LGBTQ, especially in that affects the youth. A lot of that has to do with non-supportive environments, where people are not necessarily, where when a youth comes out, they feel like they're alone, basically. And then they have to wrestle with all of these other stigmas and all of the other things in front of them without having support systems behind them, which is exactly the reason why mentoring can be such a helpful thing for them and can be so much better for them. And it is emotional abuse and gaslighting to reject somebody's identity or truth, to basically tell them that I know you better than you know yourself. So therefore, you can't be what you say you are, which is a sadly very common thing that happens to a lot of LGBTQ youth. So yeah, there's a lot on that. As far as programs go, there's actually quite a lot of hope. As mentioned, just simply having that representation is a huge aspect. And so going forward to at least look at what we can do as far as programs. Yes, the fact that LGBTQ youth would be well served by support from mentors or other individuals in the community is pretty well known, I think, to most of us. I love Mentor Nationals. Basically, their slogan for the National Mentoring Summit this year, as well as a lot of their material, has basically been that all kids can benefit from having more support, that all kids can have more support systems outside of school and the home. And that's why mentoring makes so much of a difference. So I love that. As far as what we can do kind of on a local level, when it comes to marketing, representation is very, very important. You think about, we try to recruit men and male mentors, that we try to represent them in our marketing to, make it so that they feel more, welcome or part of it, so that they can see themselves in it, or mentors of color. That representation can also be part of going to having your own representation as a mentoring program, as part of, working with local groups, local LGBT groups, local GSAs at school, gay straight alliances, being able to post even about LGBTQ issues and LGBTQ youth issues during Pride Month or at Pride events, tabling at those events as well, creating marketing that is, I hate to say directed, but that represents that, hey, we work with youth like this, and being, being more inclusive that way. having that inclusive language. It's wonderful to use they, them instead of she, her, and he, she, you know, whatever, especially as much as you can in presentations that you're not talking. It, honestly, for myself, as somebody who wrote many, many papers, I really appreciate using they or them instead of he slash she, he and or she, those sorts of things, just because it flows better. It has been a traditional part of English language since before the gendered pronoun. They goes back to the 1600s as far as use for informal language. The you was formal language, so that's a whole different argument. But anyways, and then yeah, being present at Pride events, as long as they're family friendly. You don't want to necessarily be there for the adults only aspects. But adding representation to social media and marketing. Mentor does a wonderful marketing, Mentor National does a wonderful marketing platform that they will put out for Pride Month in particular that you can find on their website. And they have a toolbox as far as marketing kits and stuff like that. And then solidarity and representation, using pronouns, even if you're not trans, to use pronouns and put them in your, whether on, you know, pins or on name tags or in emails. The reason why it makes so much of a difference to LGBTQ folks is that when we see the pronouns, oftentimes we feel like, oh, there's somebody that we can talk to. It is oftentimes a mark of an ally. It's also gets rid of a lot of the stigma around having pronouns in bios and all of those sorts of things, using them regularly. Just because if it's only trans people that use pronouns, that's another way for people to single us out. And that's kind of why we want to try to help normalize that. That's always really great. And if you can, having LGBTQ members and staff for advisory council, that's a tough one because obviously you can't ask those questions during interviews, but it kind of comes up organically. And as it becomes more and more natural and more, not natural, but more and more visible and more common, then the chances of that happening will go up quite a bit. And then yes, participation, sponsorship, or boosting local groups. There are different pride organizations for almost every town. So just helping out with them or different other local groups. A lot of cultural centers or things like that will also have some sort of pride event or some sort of LGBTQ inclusion. As far as all of Iowa, there is one Iowa, which is a much more of a lobbying group, as well as Safe Schools Iowa, which is another lobbying group, but also helps with GSAs in schools. I forget that I can't just click the next button. Anyways, so yeah, when it comes to just some simple things that can help a lot, having forms and interviews that are open-ended and not check boxes. So this is something that we moved to not that long ago, but you know, asking about preferred name. Or pronouns, leaving it optional because some people get really upset about it, but it's okay. And actually another benefit of this is actually a lot of people will put their child's nickname in that preferred name box as well, which makes it pretty easy then to know what they would like to be called, sort of thing. Leaving the gender as a blank so that it's not just male, female, other, but leaving it open so that anybody who has those sorts of things, those differences, can feel free to put it in whatever they would like. And that works well with a lot of other sort of fill-in things as well. When it comes to the actual interview with both the families and the mentors, asking about their preference to if they would, you know, it's always fun. The preferences sometimes can feel pretty discriminatory, but, you know, asking about like, would you feel comfortable working with, if your mentor was part of the LGBTQ community, transgender, or non-binary. And that's one that I have been mulling over since basically I got here and started coming out, is how do you know how do you go about necessarily having trans mentors and mentees? How do you go about that? Because a lot of us use a fairly strict same gender matching. And how do you go about those sorts of things? And as long as there is preference that is honored and that it is something that is discussed with both the family and the mentor as a way to kind of work through those sorts of things. It would be wonderful if we could match a trans youth with a trans mentor, but again, just due to percentages and possibilities of that, it's not the most common thing in the world. And it doesn't mean that just because people are trans doesn't mean that they'll get along very well. They might not have the same interests, they might not have similar backgrounds or anything that they're really, connecting over. So that part can be a little bit of a challenge as far as, and unfortunately, from my reading of the elements of effective practices, they focus very much on the youth and not so much on the mentors. So that can be something that is a little bit harder to get behind as well. And as far as inclusivity and things that you can do as well, voting and participation in petitions, sending thank yous to local, state, and national governments, those that are, actually, making a difference, that they're talking about inclusion, things like that can be a huge deal. And especially, taking the burden on yourself to inform yourself as well. It's harder for anyone from a minority to feel like they are always the answer book. I know we're going to go to Q&A, and that's basically what I set myself up as today. But that's otherwise, it's usually there are resources out there through Google, whether that be the Trevor Project, Human Rights Campaign, GLAAD. Watch out for potential propaganda. There's a lot of misinformation on the internet as well. In fact, I was on Facebook recently, and a Fox News article came up about like Trevor Carlson, and they're like, or Tucker Carlson, and I click on it, and it's like, this has been nominated to you because you are interested in transgender issues, and I'm like, not like this. That's not how I'm interested in them. And so, yeah, you got to be careful about things like that too. People will market it so that it can be attacked in that way as well. And yes, we want to mentor because we want to support the youth to live to their fullest, and having that one trusted person when they come out or when have been out can make a huge difference in building that trust and self-confidence. So, forgetting that I can't just click. Now for the fun part, Q&A. So if there are any questions about anything that was shared, anything that you think, there's a few of these things program-wise that will lead to further discussions as well of how each program wants to address them. And that can be a thing in and of itself. I know Mary has been very supportive as well for providing resources as well as just looking at what International has. But I also want to encourage you to be able to ask any questions. Feel free. There's no weird questions or anything like that. So if you ever wanted to ask your queer trans friend a question, that's me, feel free.
Annie, I have a question. This is Kathy Schwartzoff.
Sure, Kathy.
Involved in LGBTQ club at school, and that was on her form, and I use anything, it's just on the form, and she never brought up anything like that, and I wasn't sure. This was on Zoom, so I wasn't, in the room alone with her kind of thing, and I didn't feel comfortable asking her about it because I wasn't sure if her father had seen her application, if she's come out, or if she's simply an ally. And so I didn't ask. What would you have done in that situation, or what would you recommend that I should have done?
Yeah, I think actually, Kathy, you did the right thing. I mean, it's hard. I often tried not to address it like address it right away, especially. It's one of those where you definitely want to make sure that it's, you know, in private or in a space that they feel comfortable and safe doing so. Oftentimes it is great to have them bring it up on their own time. It is hard sometimes because like you'd think, and I've had this with mentor interviews or something like that, and then they'll talk about their partner, not their wife, even though that's the term they prefer to talk about their partner as, and it's like, I have the huge rainbow flag in my room, in my office. It's right behind me. Like you're talking to a trans woman with a trans mask on and stuff like that, and you don't feel comfortable, and that's perfectly fine. Like I understand it's a difficult thing, and you don't know how people are gonna react. So you just kind of have to be like, okay, I'll wait until it comes out naturally, because you don't want to try to make assumptions, and outing them,
Right.
you know, saying something about it could be really harmful.
Mm-hmm.
So, it does suck, I will say, because it is kind of just like sit and wait and then see what happens.
Well, and I think too, we have to think of it broadly as, you know, there could be lots of things that people think that they are involved in or whatever. And yeah, like you said, getting to know them better felt like the right thing. And I want her to be very safe. And she did identify as her. So
Yep.
Yeah, that helps.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's one of those that it could just be testing the water to then see what comes out later. So
I thought of that as well. Yeah, thanks.
Oh, and I should say, like, things about transition or questions or anything like that as well are perfectly welcome, as well. No weird questions too.
Has anyone else had any other issues come up in their program that you just want to throw out for the group, or see what Annie has to say as well?
So Christine had put, can you explain the difference between more romantic orientation and sexual orientation? Okay, yeah. So romantic orientation, the reason why it gets talked about especially is with those that are on the asexual spectrum for sexual attraction. So it's a very similar thing to, oftentimes, you know, people can be attracted to others in very different ways. And romantic attraction or emotional attraction or orientation is kind of like who one would like to live with, who one sees like their future spouse sort of thing with, who one would want to be in a relationship with, which is different than necessarily sexual orientation. It can be hard to describe sometimes, but as somebody who's on more of the asexual orientation, for myself, whenever I see, and sometimes it's easier just to give anecdotes, but like when somebody is very attractive, it's like, oh, they're very attractive. That's it. It's not, I want to sleep with them or anything like that. There's none of those urges sort of thing. Or they're much more subdued than like, I do not understand Tinder or hookup culture. Like it does not make sense to me. It just doesn't register in my brain because my brain doesn't work that way. So the romantic orientation then is who I would actually want to be in that relationship with, as far as like partners or, you know, long term, and that could eventually turn into a certain amount of sexual orientation there as well, or sexual activity. But it's different so far as it's not so much like there's no rumbling or anything going on. There's not like that emotional, overwhelming, like wanting to be with this person for that specific, you know, hookup reason or for that specific sexual desire. That's where a lot of that differentiation comes from. it is something that is commonly used nowadays to be like, people will put like their lesbian as their sexual orientation, but panromantic, which just means that they only ever see themselves being sexual partners with other women, as identified as women, but then they could be in a relationship, non-sexual relationship necessarily, with anybody of any gender. I don't know if that helps. So.
Danny, I have another question because we've got a youth who recently came out as non-binary, and we reached out to Iowa Safe Schools because we have a staff member who recently left us and went down there. And one of the things we're looking for is some resources for our mentors, because like we've had kids from Guatemalan entities, and so that particular, when we did their training, we did some specific things on that. Are there any resources that you're aware of that would be helpful to share with the mentor, either at their initial training or as a youth comes out, either, you know, and the youth is comfortable talking to the mentor about it?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, that is a good question. It's, so here's the resources that I know of, at least. The ones that I've tried, you know, there's the LGBTQ plus mentoring supplement to the elements of effective practice. But again, that has to do much more with the organizational level and doesn't necessarily deal with the day-to-day sort of things. Just, I think, especially working with trying to educate the mentor as much as you can, and wanting them basically to want to have that education about what that means. Non-binary is a very interesting and unique identity. Even though I am trans, I cannot speak to non-binary identities very well because it's just not my experience. And it can be a little bit of a challenge that way. As you know, wanting to use the right terms, wanting to use the right pronouns. It's even like on a program level, who do you mentor with? If you do same gender mentoring, who do you match them with? That can be something that needs to be clarified as well. But yes, so looking things for like the Trevor Project or GLAAD, GLAAD, or what's the other one? Human Rights Coalition, HRC, and different like national ones as far as that education piece goes would be really helpful. There are a few books, but there would be much more about like how to support during transition and things like that. The basics around it are very, you know, very much that you want to support them as who they are and encourage, you know, that they develop themselves to be authentically who they are, and just going along with that as well. That we're not the ones in control of it, but the youth themselves are. But yes, as far as the resources, yeah, Iowa Safe Schools would make sense for a lot of those resources. And everybody's non-binary identity can be very different than other non-binary identities. It's one of the most fluid ones that is ever present. So I don't know if that helped.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
that was helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And Kathy's typing as well. Yeah, any other questions? Comments, concerns, pithy anecdotes, violent uprisings, as my professors would always say.
See, you're demonstrating your other descriptor there. I like that you added your sense of humor in there. So.
Yeah, and personal pronouns. Yeah, which makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense too.
I do, I've seen in people's signatures with pronouns too, and I need to do this. There's a link it says why pronouns matter, and I like that. Just to kind of educate people right there in your signature line as well.
Yep. Yeah, and I've also, I think it was during the National Mentoring Summit, I've seen some that will also put their second language pronouns as well, which is a great way of also showing that they're bilingual. So, if it was for Spanish, she, her, ella as well, which is very, very beautiful way of incorporating that, hey, you're also open to other cultures as well.
Cool.
Yeah. Sadly, I don't speak Spanish, but I did.
Well, if there aren't any other questions at this time,
Yeah.
and if you just go to the last slide and do some upcoming dates, but Annie is on this calendar invite, and I'm assuming, well, actually you're right there, Annie J too, but I'm assuming you'd be open to if people just want to reach out to you directly too, if that's something you'd like to do, or if you don't find your email on this, feel free to reach out. So just a reminder of the upcoming your monthly coffee call chat on June 1st. On June 8th, you probably saw that in the newsletter if you're wondering what that is, orientation. It's really for new program staff, just to kind of share IMP resources and also some of the things with Mentor National, what they mean, like what's the mentoring connector, how does that work, and what's NQMS and all those kinds of things too. So if you are new staff or have other, want to share that with other staff in your organization, that'd be great. And I don't think I finished the June 10th trauma. Wow. Yeah, how to support, I don't know if they'll call it trauma-informed mentoring, but, to support young people that have suffered from trauma in your program too. So we'll be covering that in the June 10th professional development call. So if no one else has anything, I think we'll wrap up for today. Thank you so much.